I'm sorry, another blue sheet clipboard out there somewhere. Would somebody pick it up? Okay. John, would you grab that clipboard right quick? Does that say STIR on it? Just making sure that it didn't get confused with the last session. Being one of the first sessions, you might not have seen this slide before, although I'm looking through the room and I think that I've seen all of these faces before. Maybe I'm wrong. If you're new here, come up and introduce yourself to me at the end of the session. If you're not familiar with what is on this slide, read this slide carefully now. Understand the note well. There are obligations in the note well on you, on your participation in any session inside the IETF. Here's our intended agenda. We're going to start off working through the active working group documents, CERT delegation and RCD. Then we'll get some updates on things that are being sent to the ISG, out of bound and divert. And then any other business, if anyone brings up any. Does anybody have an agenda bash?
So if we have time, only if we have time, we might want to talk about the emergency calling and what might be interesting or useful or necessary in order to especially make a call back from the 911 system, which would be, if they wanted to, and they often don't, a 3-digit number, not a full telephone number.
All right. Well, if we have time, we'll definitely let you. I'm assuming he'll come up and lead that conversation. Yeah.
Martin Dolly, AT&T. This item is already being worked, and the IPN and I were working with ESIF to define the requirements for when a 911 call is dialed, getting to the PSAP, as well as for callback.
Awesome. This was not what I expected to happen. Okay, I can't drive.
Click that one? Yeah. Yeah. That's promising.
Hand John the clicker.
All right. Got something clicked. Let me see if this clicks.
No clicky.
No clicky.
Is it turned on the back?
Is it turned on the back? Where does it turn on the back? Oh, is it?
Yep.
Yeah. Is that clicky?
All right, I'll advance stuff for you.
Okay. That still does not seem to clicky. Wait, maybe that worked. I now see a green light.
It's okay. The keyboard's not advancing anything either.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not sure mic is on that.
Is this time the mic actually on? At my last meeting, it was not on yet. Okay. Hi, so we are back again with this exciting story about delegation, which is a specification we have here, which is now a working group item, as you can see from the fancy -IETF up there, which basically sets out to explain how delegation works for STIR. Now, this is something we talked about in 8226. 8226 said you could just kind of do delegation from these TN auth list objects to other objects. But we figured it would probably be helpful to go through and just kind of explain what that would mean in practice, to find out if there were gaps, things we wanted to fill in that would kind of make this make more sense. One of the aspects of that, of course, is dealing with certificate chains instead of dealing with just you're going to get a cert from the X5U and the passport and use that to figure out if you can validate the call on the terminating side. And finally, there's a bit of interaction with ACME that entails. And this is going to support a number of use cases. Next slide.
We have some doing it that painful way.
We will have some pain in the way this is being done, as it should be in the IETF. We are the few, the devout, who are up for the pain. So why are we talking about this? I mean, there's really one basic thing that is motivating the discussion about this in the industry that has made this so hot recently. And it's this prospect that sometimes outbound calls just are not going to transit the authentication service of a carrier who owns the calling party number. And there are, the poster child of this is this common case of an enterprise, say, who acquires TNs from one provider, but in fact does least cost routing across a number of outbound providers. And what if this call is going to go out through a different outbound provider than the person they got the numbers from? How are they supposed to sign it? And actually, a lot of the sort of legitimate spoofing cases we talk about sometimes, these are the cases where, the doctor's office, right, wants to be able to call from some number and that doctor's on the road, right, and they want to be able to attest this. These are the things that are basically motivating getting delegation done and have kind of put the fire under this. So what we want to do is we want to be able to push credentials from the TN owners. The term TN service provider, I think, is starting to gain a little currency in the industry as we talk about this. From those TN service providers to an AS that is actually able to sign for the call. Maybe if this is an enterprise that has a ton of SIP infrastructure, that could be the enterprise itself. Maybe it could be the outbound carrier itself. Maybe there could be a third-party service that's doing it. It doesn't really matter. This entire architecture is agnostic to those sorts of questions. But the reason we want to do this is the bullet you see at the bottom here. The alternative really seems to be letting outbound carriers sign for calls where they don't own the number. And, and the draft talks about this in the motivation section, that kind of diminishes a lot of the purpose of what we've been here to try to accomplish. If basically any carrier is going to be able to sign for any call, obviously there's a number of great, extremely trustworthy and responsible carriers out there that will only sign for appropriate calls for this. But of course, those aren't the people that have caused these massive problems with impersonation that have led to all the robocalling, voicemail hacking, and the remainder of the difficulties that we face that motivated this work in the first place. Next slide. Feel the pain, feel the burn of the slide advancement mechanism. Okay, so there are hard edges on this. I'm not going to pretend that everything about this is easy or obvious. We know that early deployment of STIR, especially in the Shaken framework, is based on SPCs and the notion you've got an SPC. These OCN level certs are something we've kind of bandied around in that environment. And so there's two real ways to look at a high level at how you do delegation from the TN off list object as it's defined in RFC 8226. Some of these non-carrier entities probably should have SPCs. Whether they count as real carriers or not, if you were assigned large, contiguous or non-contiguous, complicated blocks of 500,000 numbers, I don't really want to try to represent something like that in a TN off list object. That would be nuts. And we talk about some of the alternatives to that in the draft. But for some of these entities, it might make sense for them to have an OCN or a pseudo OCN of some kind. Yes, Mary.
Well, I was going to say, there are already non-carriers that have OCNs.
Oh, there are. Yes. Yeah. And so, again, and that process and what that's going to mean as the regulatory framework revolves around this is interesting. So one important thing to understand about this draft is not saying don't do that. This draft is saying there are cases where you want to do that. Then there are these other cases where, again, like Newstar, I'll take as an example of an enterprise, right? We've had these 1,000 blocks under 571434 for like 20 years. Nothing gets ported in or out of them. They're extremely simple. They're contiguous. And for these kinds of entities, it might make sense to actually use the TN blocks themselves in the certificates. And so I think one size doesn't fit all. We want to talk about some enterprise where an OCN would be overkill, right? Where you really can just capture, these are the resources this person has and push that out from that. Now, the thing that makes this the hard edge on this is this concept of encompassing. This is something that we stole in the delegation mechanism from RPKI. RPKI has this idea that the way that kind of blocks trickle down from the IANA through tier 1 carriers to, the various entities that end up advertising these blocks on the internet is that, each kind of successive step needs to be provably encompassed by its parent certificate and the scope of authority of the parent certificate. And so there's a lot of design questions in this that are interesting questions. And this is one I'd like to talk about today. If people would like to get up and talk about it, this is an open issue in the draft. We all know that at some point the rubber meets the road here. The verification services on the terminating side of calls are going to get a call assigned by a certificate. It's from a calling party number, and they need to make some determination. Should this have been signed by the entity that signed it? And, we need to understand at least where we think in the architecture the right place is to perform that encompassing check. And there are a couple of alternatives for this. You could do it when the certs are issued. For example, if you're delegating from some particular, if you're a carrier, you want to delegate down to a simple number block like new stars, there could be a process that checks at the time that delegation is performed. Oh yeah, that's actually legit. That could be part of the CA's job, in other words, before this gets issued, or maybe the PA's job, which somebody in this architecture could be responsible for the job of figuring out whether or not this is encompassed at the time the cert is issued. The alternative is to do it like in real time, when the call is being set up. And, on the verification service side to be able to say, okay, I need to do some dip or understand, the difficulty with that obviously is that could have an impact on the actual call setup time. If you need to wait for that result, before you start alerting the user, that's kind of a big deal. And that's a trade-off. And, I don't know the right answer. And if you want to talk about this now, I'd love to talk about this now. I think you could do it in both places, even. Maybe you need to do it in both places. I'd like to think it is possible at least to push that to the certification itself, to the CAs, to at least the ecosystem responsible for the issuance of certificates, to make sure somebody checks this encompassing stuff and is being audited and checked on to make sure it's actually worked. Mary, let me get my water here.
Very Lawrence. It is complicated, and part of it is we still have a dependency on these existing identifiers that are assigned to service providers, and that's very complicated, right? Because of number portability and that sort of thing, right? So it's actually, if you really wanted to check it on the verification side, you actually have to check more than one place even.
Sure.
Right? That's it. So it is very complicated. You could do it on the authentication side, right? And
you could.
Sure, right. And so your SBC token would then, you would want to bind that with your OCN and the TN range, right?
I mean,
you could do it there, right?
I mean, and again, this architecture could allow you to bind an OCN to another OCN as a delegation, right? Let's just say.
We have that notion of overall OCNs as well. Throw that into the mix.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I'm much more concerned about just architecturally, if we're going to do something like this, where do we want that authority and that responsibility to reside in the architecture? My preference would be that it be something that happens offline, I guess, rather than happening during call processing.
So part of the question is whether or not we here can make that decision on, to me, we're going to have to provide tools that they could use depending upon.
Oh, and fair enough. And we are only doing the plumbing here, right? I mean, I think we can offer guidance to say this is the consequence of doing it this way versus that way. And I don't think we're going to tell you only do it this way.
No, I think we're going to have to describe these are the things you could do in the authentication service. These are the things the verification service could do. And these are the caveats if you try and do it there and, the limitations, right?
Yeah, I mean, in certification, I wouldn't leave the certification one out again, because it's not just because the AS is also during call processing.
I think you could do that with the SBC token, but that's just me. Do the binding at that time of the check there.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. No two ways about it.
Chris went. I'm not sure I agree that it's complex. I mean, it should be possible to map. Like you can do the lookup on LERG and MPEG, and there's a mapping there that can be checked. But that's just a single comment. I think the broader thing I'd like to see is that we enable it on both sides, and let folks choose whether we should do it on the front end, or if I want to, I should be able to verify it on the back end as well.
Definitely.
Depending on what I want to do. So I think that's the key thing, that the end-to-end can be validated on both sides, and you don't have to necessarily trust one side or the other. You can do your own on both sides.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes without saying that verification services are going to access all kinds of analytics and things like that right before a call actually ends up alerting a user. And so as a consequence of that, sure, any number of checks could be formed at that point. Yes, Russ.
Hi, Russ Housley, the remote participant, speaking from the participant mic. So I think it's really important that the CA check what it can before it issues the cert. The reputation of the cert is just going to diminish to useless. Of course, there's an interval while the certificate is good where things could change. And so allowing validation later is not a bad thing, but we do need to make sure that we are accommodating validation by people who can't do an impact with it.
Yeah, and I mean, that is one of the virtues of actually having the telephone numbers get inscribed themselves for these enterprises where it does work, right? And it won't work in all cases, but in the cases where it is a simple number range, having that in there does really help a verification service that does not ordinarily interface with the NPAC and the LURG and things like that to figure out whether or not I should accept this call.
With regards, just to obviously plus one what Russ said about like the CA should verify things at issue this time. That's kind of baseline ground rules for PKI. I think it's also worth kind of keeping an eye on like whether we're kind of engineering ourselves in a circle here. Because like if these things can only be verified by doing a live check at verification time, the PKI is adding no value.
Yeah.
You might as well just sign with an arbitrary public key.
Yep.
Check it when you check.
Yep.
So yeah, given that we have the sunk cost of some PKI concepts here, it seems like maybe we shouldn't throw that away and turn in the interest of pure runtime verification.
Hi, this is Sean Turner. To kind of just pile on here, I don't know how you would write a CP that says in the validation section of identity, just be like, put whatever you want in there. I don't know how anybody's ever going to.
Yes, you do. You just wrote it.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, no relying party or subscriber agreement is going to like buy off on that. So at the end of the day, I think you have to do some pre-validation somewhere to get some kind of warm and fuzzy for the CA is actually validating the things that are bound in the cert. Because otherwise, like Richard said, what's it good for?
So, just be aware, this does put a requirement on the CA, right, in this instance, to actually have access to those resources and perform that check. And that's not bad. It's just something we need to note in the architecture.
As long as CAs are willing to buy into that, right?
And again, the CA and PA functions are kind of modularized out in Shaken, and we don't design Shaken here, I'd say for the 50th time. But like you can imagine that being the PA's job or the CA's job, just depending on how Shaken wants to carve it up. We're not going to decide that there. I don't care.
Yeah. One thing about some of these databases, they're actually not real time. Right?
Yeah. Oh, I know.
It's not real time, believe it or not, people. You can actually get a daily download now. That's a newer feature in recent years.
Daily downloads. Very nice. It's like a daily dozen. Yes, Chris.
Well, Chris went. The authority token, the CA doesn't necessarily have to do that. It should be able to rely on the authority token if that's part of the ecosystem that we're building. So, it's not direct checking, but it should be able to depend on that token.
Yeah, agreed. And this is part of why we're not saying what we want to do in Acme at the moment, because we're still trying to figure this out. When we figure this out, we'll know if anything in the authority token challenge needs to actually reflect this or not. So, yes.
So I'm kind of surprised this continues to be an issue, but like I would remind folks that the A in CA is authority, and these things exist to make statements upon which other parties rely.
Yeah.
And so if those statements are not being based on something.
Yeah. I hear you.
It shouldn't be.
Yep. There's no point in having it at all, man. Yep, agreed. All right, next slide. I think we talked this one down a bit. Money. It's drag. So another element of this, and this goes to certification authorities and what we mean by being a CA in this. Obviously, the way this is specified in the delegation draft now, we're assuming that you'll be able to get a certificate from the CA if you're a carrier that has this CA bit set to true in it to enable delegation. This is how classic X509 delegation works. We even bake that into the Acme ATC mechanism so that when you go to get an authority token that you would then present to a CA, you can ask that authority, hey, give me something that allows me explicitly to get a certificate that I can delegate from myself. Now that has, this has edges on it. It means we're dealing with certificate chains now. If you have a CA that is basically acting as the CA for both the carrier certificate and the delegate certificate in this instance, probably it's possible to collapse that chain. There are a few ways to do that, and we may also be able to do some cross-certification to consolidate credentials and permissions. If you're an enterprise and you get numbers from like 3 different carriers who are all delegating down to you, there are some cross-certification strategies we could explore so that you as an enterprise only have to hold 1 credential to sign with instead of having to choose from a roster. I have heard concerns expressed about this in the past. If it turns out that it is onerous to have the CA bit set, there are alternatives that we can explore for this. And the work that I would probably steal from this is this IETF TLS subcerts mechanism. And a subcert is basically a document that is signed by a normal end entity cert that contains most of the junk that would be in a cert to begin with. And this is a workaround that has been developed for precisely these sorts of use cases where you can only get an entity cert. The web PKI is very ossified this way. And this would be a path we could go down if for whatever reason, if there was enough administrative pressure, people didn't want to be able to have the CA bit set. This is direction that we could take and just create these kind of pseudo certs with a narrower scope. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, well, actually, it's Willie.
Yeah, Billy, what's up, man?
Don't I look like him?
Yeah.
Do you want to just delegate endpointing certs or CA issuing certs?
Well, so we're talking about potentially delegating CA issuing certs. If we're going to have multiple chains of delegation, there are certain kinds of service providers who they get numbers from a carrier, but they then in turn are doling those numbers out to a variety of customers, right? And so for that instance, I could imagine there being multiple levels actually of these delegated certs. Ordinarily, I think for typical operations, if you're a carrier and you have an enterprise customer, you would be giving them an EE cert that they would then be using to sign these things from.
Hey, Sean Turner. So one of the nice things that if you do decide to do the STIR variant, like the draft TL subcerts is, you're going to get free security analysis. They're going to go off and do a security proof with some guys who are smart at making sure that we're not blowing up TLS.
Yeah.
Because if you're just gonna like willy-nilly start doing things that hasn't been like investigated, there'd be dragons there, right? So
yep.
it'd be nice that if you were to decide one way or the other, that this idea might have a little bit better feeling because the security reviewer community would have actually had a look at it and have a formal proof to show that the security still works.
Yeah. I mean, and I'll be very upfront about this. My preference would be to do classic X509 delegation with the CA bit set. It's just if it turns out that there's some artificial market constraint that is going to preclude that in the short term, I would be willing to go build a variant of subcerts that works for STIR just so we could get like something out there in the interim. That would not be my preference.
Fair enough. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Max Para Cable Labs. If you go towards a variant of certificates, why not, and Russ, don't scream at me, why don't you think about proxy certificates, which are X509 certificates with everything is just restricted delegation. So they're meant to delegate a functionality to someone else without being a CA.
But I think the difficulties we've had when we've looked at the alternatives to this has been not a lot of them support the narrowing of the scope of the name. And that this is the thing that's
part of the validation that you do. So it's up to who's validating the certificates out.
Well, but again, this is exactly the discussion we were just having. We want the CA to tell you what you need to do to validate without you having to do some kind of external check or something like that, right? And so, like, because if we hope to build that into the cert to avoid having to do a lot of verification service, kind of busy work during call setup time, I think that we would need something that has a very particular set of qualities. If in fact these proxy certs have that quality, that, again, think about it like RPKI encompassing. This is exactly that, right? If you've got a /16 and you want to be able to just have a subcert for, a 24 from that, like, does that work or not with proxy certs?
Yes, but not using name constraints.
Well, we don't actually use classic X509 name constraints. We have our own name constraint variant.
In TN off list.
Yeah. Okay. We can look into it. Good suggestion. We'll look into it.
Couple of things. I mean, obviously, either of these paths solves the problem, and they're fine. And I care that we solve the problem, not exactly which path it has. But like, I'm actually slightly lean towards the subcerts over the other one. In fact, and the reason why is sort of silly, but it is every single time I go to tell someone, an operator or an implementer, that they need to manage private keys for a cert, they're like, "Ooh, no, not a cert. We will need God only knows what policy to apply." And when I say you need to manage a token that enables you to do absolutely everything in the world, they're like, "Oh yeah, we'll just check that in source code, control the rest." I mean, like, like one's easy and one's hard, and they're the same thing.
Yeah.
So I slightly lean the other way, but I was great.
Okay. That's good feedback. I'd like to hear other views on that.
I mean, I lean slightly the opposite direction as Richard Barnes again. I think the X509 delegations seemed a little bit cleaner because we have a little bit more to draw on, a little bit more machinery that kind of just works. The subcerts thing can obviously be made to work. It's pretty greenfield. We can kind of make it do what we need it to do. We would need to add some stuff to it, especially wanting to have multiple levels of delegation.
Yeah. So we would have to do a one-off draft. I think we would not be able to just say we're using that.
I mean, there is one advantage that subcerts has relative to things, to some other alternatives here, is that there is a non-zero amount of running code.
Yes.
Like there's already some prototype implementations of Cloudflow's running, and I think there's a couple of major web players who are interested in building stacks and deploying stuff. So you're not going to get like the interop that PKI code has, but I mean, in the race between the STIR specifics of PKI code and subcerts might be kind of a tie.
Okay.
Clint Wilson. I'd also kind of lean towards, back away from Richard, I lean towards the subcerts only because it is something that we've already worked on implementing. It's much more tenable as a solution from a CA implementation perspective, whereas the X509 delegation, as was mentioned, is kind of a big no-no in web PKI, and so it'd be harder to make infrastructure that supports that ability.
And I do get, I mean, the anxiety Cullen expressed, like no carrier who is not in the business of running CAs wants to hear, wait a minute, I'm going to have this like CA cert that is going to be able to like make stuff that sounds like scary. I don't want to do that. So yeah, I am sympathetic to that. Yes, Nick.
Yeah, Nick Sullivan. So the TLS subcerts is a little bit of a misnomer. It really is a key delegation, not a credential delegation, but conceptually what it does is take what's valid in the certificate and narrowing the scope. So conceptually it's aligned. I don't see any real problem with making a completely different variant. This specific draft is for, key lifetime narrowing, but I could see this something completely different that's based on this working.
All right, thanks, Nick. Okay, next slide. Those were the big questions. There's like a bunch of smaller questions that I think we should still work out. I think it was Richard, you pointed out, like there is in JBOT like an X5C we could use as an alternative to X5U. And like we want as a way to do certificate chains. I worry obviously that, because Passport has seen some implementation already, that people just feel like, wait a minute, it's all X5U. I don't want to like have like X5C in it or something. So I guess I don't know how people feel if we're too locked into X5U in Passport, if there's just too much code out there that just assumes that what is going to be in your JOT is going to be X5U. And so, again, we have this in like 8225, right? 8225 specifies that we're using X5U for Passport. Probably be better if we used X5C, as long as we don't think that it'll make implementations barf. Chris, what do you think about like that?
I guess this is Chris. I need a little more detail there. This is the first I'm hearing about that, so
Yeah, I mean, it's just so the JOT header can actually have, X5 unit or X5C. And I mean, it's just something they define for JOT, and we can borrow it and use that because we're gonna have these PEM certificate chains. If there's even one more step in, the certificate management than we have today. So, I mean, we have this PEM certificate chain object that is going to get pushed to you when you dereference whatever the URL is that's in the header. And it would technically be more syntactically accurate for us to use an X5C to point to that chain than an X5. Richard? Yes, no? This is your point. You tell me. I mean,
Embedding it in versus URL?
No. It's just the URL would point to, it would point to the whole chain. But the point is, I just said just stick it in X5U and forget about it, right? And just have a PEM chain there.
Just a full disclosure, I have no recollection of making this suggestion.
Oh, did you? Somebody made it. Does anyone in this room want to own up to making the suggestion? I think it was you.
I mean, I think this is really just a value of reference thing. Like the X5C one is a literal certificate chain in the job.
Right.
Like base 64 of the things and shove them in there.
Okay.
I think so. On X5U, the thing I would want to check up on for this use case is, can you provide multiple certificates in the response there? Right, because as you talk about delegation, you may have a hierarchy.
Yeah.
I think that's the case.
I thought it worked. Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's the case, then it really is just a reference.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, I like the X5C thing. I mean, we're actually currently having discussions about how we're going to do the chaining.
Okay.
For shaken. So we have 2 weeks to figure it out because we're going to let it.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
So I mean, to me, Chris, I mean, the X5C gives us desirable properties, right? That we would like to have, right? Or you think, okay, he's shaking his head. He just wants us to force PEM, but we need to talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I guess what I'd probably say is that we could put in here, let's allow either, and if whatever people want to do is probably cool. I remember this is all stuff that was in 8226. I'm just gonna make basic clarifications about how you would actually do this in practice, and suddenly people are interested in it. Eric Berger and I this morning had a good discussion about this next one, about having a good bit. And this does, I agree. I'm not sure how much value it adds. What I guess I saw in this was I could imagine having some CAs that do have access to these industry databases that can go look up and validate that this encompassing semantics actually works, but maybe there are others that just can't, right? And so it might make sense to have a distinction between those CAs that know they can go access those databases and they would put in the good bit saying, I actually went and did this validation. Whereas other ones who are like, I don't have access to that at all. I'm just like a normal CA and I don't talk to the LORG or the MPAC or something. They would be able to set that bit to no. Do people think that's stupid? I mean, I guess it really comes down to, do we think there are going to be CAs that fall into both of those categories? If we do, it seems like there may be some value having a bit that says some people go and validate the encompassing semantics before they issue the certificate and some people don't. Maybe no one ever shouldn't, right? And we just mandate no one ever shouldn't. Okay, then vote for no one ever shouldn't. Chris.
I was just reading the JWT thing. It looks to me that X5U is a URL and X5C is just explicitly.
It's just by value, yeah.
Base 64 encoded third format. So is there a difference?
Okay. Well. I mean, Mary's just saying she wants X5C, so I mean.
Hold on. I'm a little bit concerned. This is Russ, that we've turned into an NPAC-centric discussion. We need to make sure we're building a spec that'll work worldwide.
Sure. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Well, and these tools are applicable worldwide. We're just using what the use case is that's in front of us to.
So just to clarify, you can have both a chain or a certificate pointed in both X5U and X5C.
Okay.
So it really is.
Okay. We'll just keep X5U for now. Yes.
So Eric Berger. So with the good bit, I could envision that, hey, this is a piece of useful information that I as the validator can take into account. Oh, hey, it's a special super CA. Or I could see it as a kind of restraint of trade. Only special people get to be really good CAs and you can trust those other people who do it for a living. I would actually be curious, probably on the list, would people use it? Would people find it valuable, or is it just more code to write that no one's going to care about, or that it has that other, kind of business impact?
It ain't much code, but I agree with you. Yeah, I don't think we want to create kind of two classes of citizens and suggest that one of them are bad.
Richard Barnes. Maybe I'm confused here. It seems like, let me ask, if the good bit is false and the encompassing semantics have not been verified, what is the semantic that this certificate is supposed to convey?
So the certificate, right, it conveys certainly who the parent is and what their OCN or whatever is, and it conveys what has been attested as this number range, and with that a connotation that you might want to check and make sure that's true if you can. Which is, I agree, that's
like an expression of
it's not. Well, so let me run this a little harder. I can imagine a case where you're doing a subdelegation from a TN range to another TN range, where you just look at it and you'll know. Nobody needed to go talk to an industry database to figure that out, right? And so I could imagine that would not require setting the good bit for you still to be able to trust it on the verifying side.
Okay, but in that case, what would the semantic of the good bit being true be?
Well, I mean, so the good.
What is the additional value?
Yeah, the good bit is
the obvious encompassing.
the good bit is not relevant to that case. I'm just saying it doesn't need to be set in order for it. The good bit would be relevant to its parent, which is delegating from an OCN to the initial TN range, right? And so.
I mean, I think you're correct. You have a really good point. But the thing is, I think it increases the confidence, right? In that this is a good guy, right? And it makes it easier. Can add to the analytics and stuff. Because the thing about this, what we're doing here is we're building up information on what we know, right? So this is another bit of information that we can add, right? We're not getting away from the fact that you've got to run analytics and stuff to get this right. Yeah, this isn't as deterministic as you might want it to be. Yeah.
So, like, maybe I'm bringing too much of like a traditional authoritative PKI sensibility to this, but usually, when an authority signs a certificate to an assignment, with the subordinates information in it, it is saying that I have verified that this is the case. The information in the certificate holds. And it sounds like what is being said here is that perhaps in any case, that statement is being taken as one of a collection of factors, not as a single.
Well, so Mary is speaking to how the certificate itself is merely an input to the certificate validation process, and then at the terminating side is an input to a broader analytics, right? That factors in other things than what's in their certificate to make decisions about whether or not you should alert a user or block the call or whatever, right? And so, I mean, I think your message is coming through. I would probably be content to dispense with the evil bit and just say that or good bit, and just have these certs. If a CA is issuing them, it should be responsible for making sure the encompassing semantics have been validated. And one handy fact of it, as I say here, is it's auditable offline, right? If you've got these certificate repositories that all these certificates are being stored in, somebody who is responsible for the oversight of the overall system could really just go through them. You can go through them like once a day. There's not that many of these certs, right? And just make sure that actually those encompassing semantics apply. There's all kinds of things like that to become possible that should hopefully serve the same purpose as a good bit would in this instance. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what I said before, being able to check 2 different, 3 different, 4 different ways is always a good thing.
Yep. We want to be able to check and validate and verify as many ways as we can. We also want this to be able to work and give you a reasonable assurance with as little shenanigans during call setup time as possible. I think it should be a design goal. And we certainly don't want to close the door on people performing those checks if they feel that they're necessary in the course of call processing. So last, I know we've spent a lot of time on this, We do need to talk some more with Acme Star about delegation and kind of the short-term approaches that they're looking at. I think there may be some overlap and reuse just in the Acme ecosystem around this, which is not so relevant to how the certs themselves are constructed, but just in terms of easy ways to get them and make sure that they stay fresh. I think that's it. I think I might have another slide. I think I have another slide that doesn't need to be shown, but you can show it. I think it just says next steps, resolve issues, continue. Work. Course correction time. People think this on the right track. Anybody here thinking these are the wrong questions to be asking? They're more fundamental questions, other things we should be doing?
All right, Martin Daly, AT&T. Okay, so we in our IPPBX lab in Middletown, who does the verification of IPPBX before they connect to our network. We talked to them about delegated certs, and unanimously, we got an answer back of hell no. I've shared this in the IPNI, and I think I said it here several times, but that's our.
Can you do more than hell no? Like this?
Yeah, I mean,
okay. So, all right. So if we look back in the early 2000s or whatever, the IPX, the PBX community was actually pulling IT functions, into the enterprise. Okay, and then several years later, the phenomena or the pendulum, shifted the other way, where they were wanting the carrier to do more and more on their behalf. And today, particularly with everything moving to the cloud, it's moving further and further from within the enterprise. And so you take all of those into account. Our feeling, in talking to the vendors and actually even talking to our customers is that they're not going to be doing things like this. I know for the AT&T IP Flex Reach service, which is our biggest service, we actually in our database and our app server in the network actually have a list of numbers that our customers are using that are AT&T's, numbers that the customers using that come from another carrier, and most recently we actually added a field for lack of a better word, vanity numbers, and these numbers are numbers that they want to use for purposes of display purposes.
So a lot to unpack in that one. I guess I'd say.
I find this confusing. Like I'm CTO of the largest enterprise vendor of enterprise PBXs, and I know we want this, and we're implementing it, and we want to delegate it. So I'm not saying I'm sure that I believe everything you're saying, but it seems like there's some miscommunication between the two of these.
And I also talk to carriers and enterprises who want to delegate. Some people may not want to delegate, and that's okay.
So Cisco is one of the vendors to which I was speaking about. And
sure, yes. What was it more nuanced or detailed, the position on? I mean,
Well, so let me.
We talked privately about sort of trying to align this, but it seems like there is some confusion. I mean, Barton, I know you heard what you heard, and I know you heard it from a Cisco person, but I'm trying to figure out what that is and figure that out, because I think that there is everything Martin said about, we see the same thing, that there's people moving more services to the cloud from on-premise, and there's many, from Ring Central through to Cisco, all range of that scene. Okay? So that's happening, but I think that that's pushing a need actually for this delegation even more. And people are getting, like you said, about people getting numbers from lots of places, definitely happening. So I don't know, it seems like maybe we can pull some information about a bunch of these vendors and figure out what the actual need is.
Yeah, and I just want to harp on this one point here on motivation. push credentials from TN owners to NAS able to sign for the call. That does not mean the enterprise necessarily. And this is something that's this architecture is not specific to the notion that the enterprise is going to end up being the entity that has these delegated certs. These delegated certs are there. Maybe it's a cloud service. Maybe it's the outbound carrier. Maybe again, Martin, maybe your service is going to get a delegated credential from Verizon to sign for numbers that are for Verizon's customers. And you're going to be the one using it. The thing we want to get back to again is this thing on the bottom of, if what ends up happening from this is outbound carriers signing, even though they don't own the number, with credentials that have no relationship to the ownership of that number, I mean, my greatest fear for STIR and Shaken deployment overall, honestly, is just this point, because this is how we end up right where we started, in a place, because it's great if AT&T does it, but it's not great if every carrier can sign for any number that they think they should be able to sign for with an AS station. And this is the way we could get something fielded by the end of 2019 or into 2020 that will make people think that STIR accomplished nothing. And like, again, other than traceback, it doesn't enable traceback, but it certainly doesn't enable anything for real-time blocking or for real-time processing. And that is my biggest concern about this overall project at the moment. And I think we have to get past it. Chris.
I think the two use cases that I see most are actually not really the PBX, although it can be used by the PBX, obviously. The two use cases that I see that are most critical, at least near term, are VoIP providers that don't have direct access to telephone numbers and want a solution. We have wholesale customers that have directly asked us the question and are supportive of this work. And then the other one is not really the enterprise, but more like outbound call centers and things like that, where they really do want to control what is, and this sort of correlates with RCD a little bit.
Which we need to get to. I'm sure we're using like all our time here.
Where they want to control, how they want to sign the call, they want to sign what's being shown to the customer, and they want to be able to control the experience for the customer. So I think those are sort of the two top of mind things from our perspective are most important here.
Yeah, so Eric Berger, I would offer the last two statements are dead wrong, dead incorrect, and delegated certs could make things better. Right? How? Well, could make things better. But I would say the saying that allowing, like when AT&T, as Martin keeps saying, I'm going to give a attestation to Fidelity, that is enough for real-time authorization blocking. It's enough for penalizing them if they're lying. It's enough for finding the bad guys. So making statements that, AT&T is going to break.
Of course I didn't say that. I said it's great if AT&T does it for Fidelity. It's not so great if some other carriers who have different policies, but again, we have a goose and gander problem in this. And like, if you're just thinking about it, what do I need to do to sign from a goose perspective? I don't want to have to do a lot I just want to be able to sign things. It's very simple. The problem is the verification side of that. Once this gets to the gander is where this could this could tank this entire effort.
Is this because of a focus on what is a attestation?
No, well, I mean, the attestation levels are a factor, but I'm just much more concerned about the fact there is a class of carriers before any of the STIR station stuff came along, right? Who apparently are willing to, send numbers, calling party numbers out into the telephone network that are not legitimate, that are responsible for all the impersonation, all the voicemail hacking, all the robocalling stuff that we've talked about here. And I see no reason why, if we open the door to, hey, it's okay for carriers to sign for whatever number they want, even if we do that with the best intention of having a set of carriers who are very reliable, like have an easy life, the unfortunate consequence of that, if that is the policy of the network, is that it is not going to change the fact that these actors who have not been as responsible in the past are going to leverage that to continue to impersonate, except now it will be with STIR Shaken, and we've accomplished nothing.
No, they will find themselves at the wrong end of an enforcement action.
They will, in traceback terms. Yes, 3 months later, there will be a problem about them.
A lot faster, and that's why I said that statement's not helpful.
Well, so, I mean, I think the real thing I'm trying to say there is that real-time blocking and authorization have changed the story a bit from where we were when shaken.
That has absolutely nothing to do with whether you have an A attestation or a C attestation.
Well, like, I think attestation is kind of orthogonal to this, yeah. But the point is, you need the information in real time if you're going to do real-time blocking.
Right.
And traceback has a different purpose than real-time blocking does. I don't see the word A attestation on here, but
Well, then why do you say that this doesn't enable real-time blocking?
I mean, so again, because if the principle you're willing to accept is, okay, this was signed for by a carrier, someone who NECA is willing to give these things to, and there's a long line developing, so I'll shut up in a second.
And if that carrier is known to be delivering bad stuff, and that number that's signed is known to be doing bad stuff, it's going to get blocked.
I said it's a good start, right? I said this is a good start.
And that's not a traceback thing. That is a whack the call.
Okay. It's a real-time after traceback.
How long does it take to validate this?
All right, there's a long line. I know we're not even gonna have time for RCD.
Let me just clarify. So like your presumption is that there's some service that will tell me who the bad OCNs are, bad carriers.
He runs one of them.
For example, but like someone's got to get on that list before they can then be subject to real-time enforcement. I think
And that is based on a pattern of bad behavior, yes.
If there's validation of control of the assets up front, and someone can't sign something they don't own, then you never arrive at the situation.
Yes, it makes it even better, yes. But I'm saying it's a good start.
But this is what I was saying about
Good
high
start.
latency real-time.
Yeah, good start does not mean doesn't work.
Maybe real-time, but only after someone has figured out this person is bad, which could take a 3-month enforcement action.
No, it could take at least 15 minutes.
All right. Under 2 seconds, come on.
Ted Hardy, clarifying question.
Yes.
Believe it or not. So in a lot of other carriers' situations, where we have similar situations, one of the principal issues is that it is relatively easy for somebody who wishes to behave as a gander to mint a new identity and to become a gander over and over and over again with new identities.
Yep.
This occurs in spam, it occurs in AS impersonation, it occurs other places. My question to you is that this environment is different. This is a question.
It's his question. He's asking how NECA works and how you get OCNs.
Okay, and so what I'm asking here is there a way for somebody who has previously been given an OCN, which has ended up on this list, to be traced to future applications to the same authority or not? Because if the answer to that is no, then what you're doing is setting up a periodicity that's related to
I got it. Yeah. Which isn't terribly quickly.
Okay.
But that much said, there are a lot of them out there. And so you know, some people may have an opportunity to cycle through them rapidly, but it's a relatively constrained resource. They're relatively difficult to get. I imagine there could be analytics that could let you make correlations, but it's tricky.
Okay, so let me make sure I understood this correctly, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is that in this case,
in this specific shaking case, yeah.
Because the OCN is relatively difficult to get, the threat model really shouldn't be people minting new identities freely, but whether the burden of creating a new OCN is met by the kind of financial gain of being willing to be the originator of this sort of traffic.
Yes.
And I think if that's the question you're asking, there's an analysis we could do to figure out where that breakpoint is.
Understood. Yep.
That turns it into whether or not the better situation where you never have to go through this 15 minutes, or whether you never have to look for this OCN lookup at all as part of this, is worth the additional effort and money that will go into enabling these other use cases. Because I think that it's quite clear from your answer that there is a risk here. It's not the same risk as we see in environments where they're freely minted identities, but it's also not clear how that risk and reward will match once this is very common.
And there's further wrinkles in this, like if you're using like pseudo OCNs, like SPCs that are not quite OCNs, those could have very different properties in terms of how quickly you can acquire them and how quickly they can be correlated. And so, I mean, there's a lot of edges in this we'd need to analyze. But I really was not trying to pick too much of a fight with this, and I apologize if those were like kind of divisive the way that I put that there.
Yeah, so the overhead, Ted, of trying to get yet another OCN, it's not going to be worth their effort.
But if it's a pseudo OCN, right, that's a
The thing
different.
is, they still have to go through the rigmarole, jumping hoops, setting up an account with the PA and all that sort of thing, right?
It depends on how those are issued, but yeah, if it requires the PA to issue them, then yeah.
They can't play in this game unless they come to the PA and create an account, right?
Sure.
I mean, that's the all we have.
And we've used like all of STIR's time on this one
Yeah,
document.
we are out of time. So
Chris, do you want to speak about RCD for 5 minutes?
No, I think we're going to set up a virtual interim, probably at the early part of September. I'll send a note to the
Sorry.
list to get a poll for who can make it.
Okay. Okay.
But let's keep the discussion going on the list.
All right. Well, thanks for coming. And I think we needed to have this discussion, so it was a good discussion. And I think we have at least some points of where we will go for another iteration of this draft. This is a simple draft. We'll be done in another iteration or so. Anybody else need low sheets? Yeah, sorry I beat your record today. Good discussion. They're here? Yeah, right. Yeah.